What would you do if the world left you with nothing but a dead man's legacy and a piece of paper everyone said was worthless? What if you took that paper, the deed to a patch of forgotten dust once owned by a notorious outlaw, and traded your last silver dollar to make it your own, all while the town's most powerful man laughed in your face? For 21-year-old Rebecca Graves, this wasn't a question. It was the only path left. But the truth waiting for her in that barren valley, a secret buried deeper than rock and older than memory, was about to rewrite the fortunes of every soul in the county. Settle in and let us know where in the world you're watching from, as we tell a story of quiet courage and the inheritance that changed everything. Rebecca Graves arrived in the town of Copper Hill on a Tuesday. The sun a hot, white coin in a bleached blue sky. Dust coated everything. The tired planks of the boardwalk, the drooping brim of her hat, and the gray muzzle of the old gelding, Gideon, who pulled her dilapidated wagon. She had buried her father 3 days prior, a quiet affair in a lonely churchyard 200 miles east. There had been no one to mourn him but her, and nothing to mark his passing but a simple wooden cross she'd carved herself. He had left her with 2 things of value: the aging horse that had served him for 20 years, and a folded yellowed deed, kept in a worn leather satchel. Her father, a prospector who'd chased whispers of gold his entire life, had won it in a card game from a dying man a decade ago. It was for a plot of land called Crow's Rest, named for the outlaw, Jedediah Crow Kane, who had died there years before, shot dead by a posse that couldn't be bothered to bury him. She stepped down from the wagon, her movements stiff from the long journey. Her boots, worn thin at the soles, made a soft, final sound on the hard-packed dirt of the main street. She was a slight figure, made smaller by the vast, indifferent landscape and the oversized canvas coat she wore, a hand-me-down from her father. Her face, framed by strands of sun-bleached brown hair, was young, but her eyes held a weariness that didn't belong to a woman of 21. They were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. She tied Gideon's reins to the hitching post outside the land office, giving his neck a slow, reassuring stroke. The horse let out a long, tired sigh, his ribs showing faintly beneath his dusty hide. They were 2 of a kind, her and this horse, tired, forgotten, and with nowhere else to go. The men loafing on the porch of the saloon across the street watched her, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and casual contempt. A lone woman, arriving with so little, was an anomaly, a puzzle they felt entitled to solve with their stares. Rebecca ignored them. She had learned long ago that the best response to the world's judgment was a straight back and a steady gaze fixed on the horizon. She pulled the leather satchel from the wagon seat, her calloused fingers tracing the outline of the deed within. Her father had always called it his last resort, his ace in the hole. "There's more to that land than dirt and sorrow, Becca," he'd wheezed in his final days. Crow wasn't just mean, he was clever. Now, with her pockets nearly empty and the world feeling wide and hostile, his words were the only hope she had left. She took a deep breath, the dry sage-scented air filling her lungs, and pushed open the door to the land office, a small bell announcing her arrival with a tinny, cheerless jingle. The air inside the Copper Hill Land Registry was thick with the smell of old paper, stale tobacco, and condescension. A portly, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles sat behind a tall oak counter, meticulously sharpening a pencil with a small penknife. He looked up as Rebecca entered, his expression shifting from boredom to mild irritation. "Help you?" he asked, his voice flat. Before she could answer, a louder voice boomed from a chair in the corner. "Well, look what the wind blew in. Don't see many lone doves this far into the territories." Silas Croft, the valley's cattle baron, unfolded himself from the chair. He was a big man, made bigger by a tailored leather vest and an air of absolute ownership. Everything in the valley, from the creek that watered his herds to the men who worked for him, seemed to bend to his will. He looked Rebecca up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. "Lost, little lady?" Rebecca's gaze remained steady. She walked to the counter, placing the worn satchel upon its polished surface. "I'm not lost," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm here to file a deed." She carefully removed the document and unfolded it. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. The clerk, Mr. Finch, took it from her reluctantly, as if it might crumble to dust in his hands. He read the legal description, his eyebrows climbing his forehead. "Crow's Rest," he said, glancing at Silas Croft. "This is Jedediah Kane's old parcel, up in the Alkali Flats." Croft let out a short, barking laugh. "That wasteland? Child, there's a reason the county let that deed float for 20 years. Nothing grows there but scrub brush and regret. The ground's soured with alkali, and there ain't been a drop of water on it since the Creator made dirt." He leaned against the counter, crowding her space. "What did you pay for that piece of worthless paper?" "It was my father's," Rebecca replied, refusing to be intimidated. "He passed. I'm here to claim what's mine." Mr. Finch cleared his throat. "There's a filing fee," he said, almost apologetically. $5. Rebecca reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth purse. She counted out $5 silver, her entire remaining fortune, and placed them on the counter. The metallic clink seemed to echo in the silent room. Croft shook his head, a look of theatrical pity on his face. "Wasting your last dollar on a ghost's curse. A fool's errand." He pushed himself off the counter. "You'll be begging for work on my ranch inside a week." He tipped his hat with mocking politeness and strode out of the office, his laughter lingering in the air. Mr. Finch avoided her eyes as he took out his ledger and a bottle of ink. He dipped his pen, his hand scratching across the page. With a heavy thud, he brought down an official stamp, making the transfer final. He pushed a receipt toward her. "It's yours," he muttered, "for all the good it'll do you." Rebecca took the receipt, folded it neatly, and placed it with the deed back in her satchel. She now owned 160 acres of what everyone considered to be the most useless land in the territory. What secret could a dead outlaw hide in a worthless deed? Why would a young woman spend her last dollar on dust and rock? And what is it the powerful men of this valley have forgotten? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden history and quiet triumph. As Rebecca stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, she had no answers, only a stubborn refusal to believe her father's last hope was a lie. The whispers followed Rebecca down the boardwalk like burrs on a saddle blanket. From the saloon porch, from the windows of the mercantile, from the shaded benches where the town's elders sat and judged the world, she felt their eyes. Silas Croft had already spread the news of her folly, his booming voice carrying the tale of the girl who'd bought Crow's Rest. The laughter wasn't loud or overt, but it was there, in the quick glances, the covered smiles, the way people turned their backs just a little too quickly as she passed. She needed supplies, just enough to last until she could figure out what, if anything, her new property could offer. She entered the mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her presence like a town crier. The storekeeper, a thin man with a drooping mustache, gave her a polite but distant nod. "Ma'am." She bought a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, salt, and a box of cartridges for the old rifle her father had left her. Every item felt heavy with significance, a piece of her dwindling connection to the world of commerce and community. As the storekeeper tallied the cost, he cleared his throat. "Heard you filed on the old Kane place," he said, not unkindly. "It's a hard piece of country up there. No water to speak of." "I'll manage," Rebecca said, her voice betraying none of the cold dread that was beginning to seep into her bones. She paid for her goods, the small pile of coins she had left shrinking to almost nothing. She carried the provisions back to the wagon, her shoulders aching with a weariness that was more than just physical. As she was loading the sack of flour, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see an old woman standing beside the wagon. She was small and wrinkled, her face a beautiful, intricate map of long years spent under the sun. Her hair was white and braided, and she wore a simple dress of faded calico. She was Ilara, a woman who lived on the edge of town and was regarded with a mixture of respect and fear. Some said she was a healer, others that she could read the future in the patterns of the wind. She looked at Rebecca, her dark eyes seeming to see right through the layers of dust and grief to the stubborn core within. "They laugh," Ilara said, her voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It was not a question. "Let them," Rebecca replied, turning back to her work. Ilara reached out a bony hand and placed it gently on the side of the wagon, her touch surprisingly firm. "The valley drinks from one cup," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Crow knew where the handle was. Rebecca paused, the flour sack halfway into the wagon bed. She turned to face the old woman, a question forming on her lips. But Ilara was already moving away, shuffling back towards the shadows of an alleyway, disappearing as quietly as she had arrived. The cryptic words hung in the air, meaningless and yet heavy with an unspoken truth. "The valley drinks from one cup." Crow knew where the handle was. The phrase echoed in her mind, a strange and unsettling counterpoint to the town's scorn. She finished loading her supplies, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and a tiny, defiant flicker of hope. She untied Gideon from the post, climbed onto the wagon seat, and with a soft click of her tongue, urged the old horse forward, away from the mocking town and toward the desolate, forgotten land that was now her only home. The journey to Crow's Rest took the better part of the afternoon. The wagon wheels cut a slow, lonely track through the valley floor, a landscape of relative plenty where Silas Croft's cattle grazed on seas of golden grass. The Copper Creek, the lifeblood of the region, snaked through the meadows, its surface glittering under the relentless sun. But as she followed the faint trail that branched north, the land began to change. The grass thinned, giving way to hardy sagebrush and thorny creosote. The rich, dark soil faded to a pale, sandy grit, and the air grew hotter, drier. Gideon's pace slowed, his head drooping as he pulled the wagon up the gentle, unyielding grade. Rebecca let him take his time. They were in no hurry to get to a place that promised nothing. By the time they reached the property line, marked by a single rotting wooden post, the sun was beginning its slow descent towards the western peaks. The light turned thick and golden, bathing the harsh landscape in a deceptive, momentary beauty. Crow's Rest was a shallow bowl of land nestled against the dark, sheer face of a canyon wall, and it was exactly as Silas Croft had described it. A desolate expanse of cracked earth, ghostly white in places with alkali deposits, and dotted with skeletal-looking brush. In the center of the parcel stood the remains of a cabin, its roof caved in on one side, its walls listing as if in a strong wind that had died a decade ago. A wave of profound disappointment washed over Rebecca, so sharp and cold it was almost painful. This was it. This was her father's last hope, a ruin on a patch of poisoned earth. She brought the wagon to a halt near the dilapidated structure and climbed down, her legs unsteady. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sigh of the wind whispering through the canyon and the tired breathing of her horse. She walked to the cabin, its doorway a dark, gaping mouth. The inside smelled of decay, of rat droppings and sun-baked, rotting wood. It was uninhabitable. She would sleep outside tonight. She unhitched Gideon, removing his harness with practiced, gentle hands. She led him to a patch of slightly less miserable-looking scrub and let him graze, though there was little for him to eat. Using a few pieces of wood salvaged from the cabin's wreckage, she built a small fire. As dusk deepened into a star-dusted twilight, she sat on an overturned bucket, sipping bitter coffee from a tin cup. The fire crackled, a small point of warmth and light in the vast, indifferent darkness. Gideon stood nearby, a stoic silhouette against the darkening sky. He seemed to be listening, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar sounds of the night. Rebecca felt a loneliness so profound, it felt like a physical weight on her chest. She was utterly and completely alone, the owner of nothing, in the middle of nowhere. She had failed her father's memory. She had proven the town right. And yet, as she stared into the flames, Ilara's words returned to her. The valley drinks from one cup. Crow knew where the handle was. It made no sense. But here, in the deep and watchful silence of Crow's Rest, it felt less like a riddle and more like a promise. The next morning, Rebecca awoke to a sky the color of pale rose and cool, clean air that held the lingering chill of the night. She had slept fitfully, wrapped in a threadbare blanket near the embers of her fire. Gideon was already awake, standing patiently, his gaze fixed on a particular spot at the base of the canyon wall that formed the western boundary of her property. After a breakfast of dry bread and the last of her coffee, she decided to walk the perimeter of her land, to understand the full scope of her inheritance. It was a grim survey. The soil was just as poor as it had looked, cracking under her boots. The vegetation was sparse and brittle. There was no sign of a spring, not even a damp patch of earth to suggest water might lie somewhere beneath the surface. Yet, as she made her way along the base of the canyon, she noticed Gideon's strange insistence. He kept pulling on his lead rope, trying to lead her toward a specific outcropping of dark, iron-stained rock. When she finally let him, he went straight to the base of the rock and began to snuffle at the ground, his nostrils flaring. He pawed at the dirt once, then looked back at her, a low nicker rumbling in his chest. "There's nothing there, old boy," she murmured, trying to pull him away. But he wouldn't budge. He was certain of something. Kneeling down, she ran her hand over the earth where he had indicated. It was as dry and dusty as everywhere else. She sighed and stood up, her eyes scanning the area. And that's when she saw it. It was so subtle she almost missed it. A line. A faint, almost imperceptible line of slightly greener vegetation, running from the base of that exact rock outcropping, straight as an arrow, eastward across her property toward the distant, fertile valley. It wasn't grass, but a different kind of scrub, a hardier, darker-leafed plant that seemed to be thriving where everything else struggled. It was no wider than a wagon track, a whisper of life in a landscape of death. She walked along it for a few yards, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. It was real, not a trick of the light. Something was different about this narrow strip of land. She remembered her father telling her stories about prospectors, how they'd learned to read the land, to see the signs others missed. A certain type of flower could indicate copper in the soil. A line of willows could mark an underground stream. What did this thin ribbon of green mean? It was the first anomaly, the first detail that refused to fit the narrative of worthlessness the town had sold her. It was a clue, a question mark drawn across the face of her desolate property. She didn't understand it, not yet. But as she stood there with the morning sun warming her back and her old horse standing expectantly beside her, she felt the first fragile stirring of a purpose she thought she had lost forever. She would not be leaving Crow's Rest. Not yet. Days turned into a week. The initial flicker of curiosity solidified into a quiet, stubborn resolve. Regardless of what the green line meant, this land was now her home, and the ruined cabin was her only shelter. Rebecca began to work. She was no stranger to labor. Her life with her father had been a long apprenticeship in making do and mending what was broken. She started with the cabin. Using the claw end of a hammer and a pry bar, she carefully dismantled the collapsed section of the roof, salvaging every straight board and usable nail. She cleared the interior of debris, sweeping out years of accumulated dust, dirt, and the nests of long-gone rodents. The structure was sounder than it looked, built of thick, hand-hewn pine logs that had settled but not rotted in the dry air. Jedediah Kane, for all his sins, had been a capable builder. Gideon was her constant, silent companion. He would stand tethered in the shade of the canyon wall, watching her with his soft, brown eyes as she worked, his presence a steady comfort. Every afternoon, he would still wander to the iron-stained rock outcropping and stand there, as if waiting. The work was slow and grueling. Her hands, already calloused, became raw and blistered. Her muscles ached with a deep, satisfying pain. With each log she reset, each board she nailed into place, she felt less like a victim of circumstance and more like the master of her own small, dusty world. It was during this process of repair that the clues began to compound. Tucked away in a dry corner of the cabin, beneath a loose floorboard, she found a small cache of tools. They were not the rough implements of a common ranch hand, but finer things: a geological hammer, a set of surveyor's stakes, and a heavy, well-oiled digging spade with a sharpened edge. They had been carefully wrapped in oilcloth, preserved against the years. Why would an outlaw hiding from the law need such specific tools? Later, while clearing brush near the rock outcropping that so fascinated Gideon, her shovel struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. Digging around it, she unearthed a solid iron stake, driven 3 feet into the ground. It was the kind of marker a surveyor would use to mark a critical point. Then, as she was examining the face of the outcropping itself, she noticed a series of small, deliberate carvings in the stone. They were so weathered they were almost invisible, looking like natural cracks in the rock. But as she traced them with her fingers, she realized they formed a pattern, a series of straight lines, angles, and symbols that looked less like idle graffiti and more like a diagram, a map etched into the very stone of the canyon. Her hands were learning the story of this place. Crow Kane hadn't just been hiding here. He had been working. He had been measuring, digging, planning something with a secret and meticulous purpose. The land was no longer just a barren plot. It was a puzzle box, and she was slowly, piece by piece, finding the key. The conviction grew in her until it was a certainty. The rock outcropping, Gideon's strange insistence, the surveyor's stake, the map on the stone, it all pointed to one place. Something was hidden there. One morning, armed with the spade and geological hammer she'd found, she went to the spot at the base of the rocks. The sun was not yet high, but she could already feel its heat building in the air. She began to dig. The ground was hard, a dense mixture of clay and gravel that fought against the blade of her spade. For the first hour, she found nothing but more rock and compacted earth. Doubt began to creep in. Perhaps she was just as foolish as the town thought, chasing a fantasy born of desperation. But then the spade hit something that made a hollow, wooden thud. Her heart leapt. She dropped to her knees and began to clear the dirt away with her hands. Slowly, she uncovered the edge of a heavy, timber-lined trapdoor. It was flush with the ground, its surface coated in a thick layer of hardened pitch to make it waterproof, and it was almost perfectly camouflaged. It took her another hour to clear it completely. There was no handle, only a small notch along one edge. Using the pry bar from the cabin, she wedged it into the notch and put her entire weight into it. With a groan of rusted hinges and the sucking sound of a broken seal, the door lifted a few inches. A rush of cool, damp air escaped from the opening, carrying a scent she hadn't smelled since she arrived. The smell of deep earth, of stone, and of water. It was the scent of life. With her adrenaline surging, she heaved the heavy door open the rest of the way, revealing a dark, narrow opening that led down into the rock. It was a tunnel, shored up with thick timbers, descending into blackness. She retrieved her lantern from the cabin, her hands trembling slightly as she lit the wick. Holding it out in front of her, she descended the rough-hewn steps. The tunnel was short, no more than 20 feet long, and it opened into a small, circular chamber, hand-dug from the rock itself. In the center of the chamber, bolted to the stone floor, was a massive cast-iron valve wheel as wide as her shoulders. It was rusted, but looked immensely solid, and set into a small alcove in the wall beside it was a sealed tin box. She picked it up. It was heavy. Prying open the lid, she found a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with the tight, meticulous script of Jedediah Kane. He wasn't just an outlaw. The journal revealed him to be a disgraced civil engineer from the East, a man who had fled west after a professional dispute, turned violent, and he had used his knowledge here. He had discovered a geological marvel, the valley's entire water supply. The aquifer that fed the Copper Creek flowed through a single narrow fissure deep beneath this exact spot before fanning out into the valley below. He had spent years secretly digging this chamber, installing this valve, a master tap. He had created a bottleneck. He had found the handle. Her deed, the one her father had won, had been written by Kane himself, with language so archaic and precise that it granted the owner of Crow's Rest not just the land, but primary rights to any and all water originating on the property. She controlled the cup. She controlled the entire valley. The discovery left Rebecca in a state of quiet shock. She spent the next day reading and rereading Kane's journal, cross-referencing his notes with the legal language on her deed. It was all there. He had planned to use his leverage to blackmail men like Silas Croft, to build his own empire from this worthless patch of dirt. But the posse had found him before he could turn the wheel. Now the power was hers. As this new reality settled over her, a crisis began to brew down in the valley. A brutal, unseasonable heat wave descended, scorching the land. The sun was merciless, day after day. The Copper Creek, which was normally low in the late summer, began to shrink at an alarming rate. Its flow dwindled to a trickle, and the lush grazing lands on Croft's ranch began to turn brown and brittle. Panic, like a fever, started to spread through the community. Croft's cattle grew thin, their lowing turning from a sound of contentment to one of distress. One afternoon, Rebecca saw a rider coming up the trail to her property. It was Silas Croft, his face a grim mask of dust and anxiety. He likely suspected there might be a small, undiscovered spring on her land, a last resort he could try to buy or bully her out of. He reined in his horse a few yards from her cabin, his gaze sweeping over the repaired roof and the tidy clearing. "Graves," he said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "The creek's going dry. My herds are dying. I'll give you $200 for this land, right now. It's 10 times what it's worth." This was the moment. The test. She could have gloated. She could have named an outrageous price. She could have savored the reversal of their fortunes. But as she looked past him, down the trail, she saw another wagon approaching. It was a family of homesteaders, their faces gaunt, their 2 children staring listlessly from the back. Their horse was stumbling, its head hanging low. They were the small ranchers, the families who would be wiped out completely if the water failed. She thought of her father, of their hard life, of the kindness of strangers that had sometimes been their only salvation. She turned away from Croft, her decision made. She walked to the rock outcropping, her boots crunching on the dry ground. Croft watched her, confused. "What are you doing?" he demanded. She ignored him. She lifted the heavy trapdoor, descended into the cool darkness of the chamber, and placed both her hands on the cold, rusted iron of the valve wheel. It was stiff from decades of disuse. She braced her feet and pulled with all her might. The wheel resisted, groaning in protest. She threw her entire body into it, her muscles straining, a cry of exertion escaping her lips. With a deafening screech of metal on metal, the wheel began to turn. A deep, resonant groan echoed from the bowels of the earth. She gave it one more turn, then another. Above, Silas Croft stared in disbelief as a trickle of clear, cold water began to seep from the base of the rock. The trickle became a stream, pooling in the dust before carving a new channel for itself, flowing downhill toward the dying valley. The water flowed. It filled the dusty basin at the base of the rocks, creating a clear, deep pool before spilling over and continuing its journey down the faint depression that marked the path of the greener scrub. The homesteader's horse, smelling the water, broke into a weak trot, dragging the wagon the last few yards before plunging its muzzle into the life-giving pool. The family scrambled down, cupping the water in their hands, their faces alight with a kind of desperate reverence. Silas Croft stood frozen, his jaw slack. He stared at the gushing water, then at the open trapdoor, then at Rebecca as she climbed out of the chamber, her face smudged with rust and dirt. Understanding, vast and terrible, dawned in his eyes. He saw it all, the outlaw's cleverness, the deed's hidden power, and his own monumental foolishness. He had mocked the woman who held the fate of his entire fortune in her hands. Word of the miracle at Crow's Rest spread through the valley as fast as the water itself. First came the homesteaders, who carried the news back to their neighbors. Then, one by one, the townspeople began the journey up the trail. They came not with scorn, but with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They saw the new stream, the revived land, and the quiet young woman who had brought it forth. Among them was Mr. Finch, the land office clerk, his face pale with professional anxiety. He carried his official ledger with him. He approached Rebecca hesitantly. "Miss Graves," he began, "the homesteaders. They said, is it true?" Rebecca simply handed him Jedediah Kane's journal. He sat on a rock, adjusting his spectacles, and began to read. He compared the outlaw's notes to the fine print on the original deed record in his own ledger. The townspeople watched in silence, waiting for the verdict. After a long time, Mr. Finch looked up, his expression one of pure astonishment. He closed his ledger with a soft thud. "It's ironclad," he announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying in the still air. "The language is archaic, but legally sound. The primary water rights for the entire Copper Creek aquifer originate on this parcel. The rights belong to her." A collective murmur went through the crowd. The chorus of mockery had transformed into a chorus of reverence. Silas Croft, humbled and defeated, walked over to Rebecca. The bluster and arrogance were gone, replaced by the weary pragmatism of a man who knows he has been outmaneuvered. He didn't offer an apology, but his tone was a concession in itself. "What are your terms?" he asked quietly. Rebecca looked from his anxious face to the faces of the other ranchers and farmers gathered around. She saw not just greed, but fear. They were all at her mercy. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. The golden hour light of late afternoon spilled across the valley, turning the newly greening pastures to amber. Weeks had passed since the day the water returned. Crow's Rest was no longer a name spoken with a sneer. It was the heart of the valley, its source of life. Rebecca stood on the porch of her small, sturdy cabin, which she had now fully repaired. A porch swing, a gift from the town carpenter, moved gently in the evening breeze. She hadn't exiled anyone. She hadn't bankrupted Silas Croft. Instead, she had held a meeting. In the very town that had scorned her, she laid out her terms. She established a water council with herself at its head, but with representatives from every ranch, big and small. They drafted a charter of fair use, ensuring that everyone got the water they needed, with allocations based on acreage and herd size, but with a guaranteed share for even the smallest homesteader. She had turned absolute power into shared prosperity. A rider was making his way up the trail. It was Croft's foreman, leading a fine-looking young mare with a coat the color of dark honey. He reined in at her porch and tipped his hat. "Miss Graves," he said respectfully, "Mr. Croft sends his compliments, and this horse, as a token of his appreciation." Rebecca smiled softly. She walked down the steps and ran a hand along the mare's strong neck. Gideon, standing nearby in a small corral she had built, watched with placid interest. He was retired now, living out his days in peace and comfort. The foreman hesitated, as if wanting to ask something. Finally, he did. "We were all wondering, miss, what you're going to call this place now. Crow's Rest doesn't seem to fit anymore." Rebecca looked around her. She looked at the scrubby, rocky ground of her own 160 acres, land that was still, by any practical measure, worthless. Then her gaze drifted downward, across the thriving, verdant valley below, a community saved from ruin, a future secured. She thought of the deed, the water, the power she held but chose to share. She turned back to the foreman, her eyes clear and calm. "It isn't about what you own," she said, her voice carrying the quiet weight of a hard-won truth. "It's about what you look after. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story. It's a powerful reminder of the quiet power of stewardship, and how true wealth is measured not by what we possess, but by what we nurture and protect for others." If this story of resilience and hidden strength moved you, please consider leaving a like and a comment below to let us know. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more tales of forgotten history and unexpected heroes. We have another story coming soon, about a lonely lighthouse keeper who discovers a secret in the fog that will save a ship and change his life forever. Until then, be well.